The Zephyrian Galactic Zoological Preserve stretched across 3 moons, its crystal domes gleaming under twin suns. For over 3,000 years, it had been the crown jewel of scientific achievement. Visitors from every corner of the galaxy came to witness the most diverse collection of sentient life ever assembled. Each habitat was a masterpiece of environmental engineering, perfectly recreating home worlds down to the smallest detail. Director Veltar stood before the central command display, his crystalline body refracting the soft blue light of the control room. As a member of the crystalline species, he valued order above all else. His people had built their entire civilization on precise calculations and systematic approaches. Everything had its place, everything followed the rules, and chaos was simply not tolerated. But today, chaos was exactly what he faced. The human exhibit had gone silent 3 weeks ago. Not empty, mind you. The specimen was still there, still breathing, still consuming the carefully calculated nutritional supplements. But he had stopped doing anything interesting. For months now, visitors would press their faces against the transparent walls only to see a figure sitting motionless in the corner, staring at nothing. This was a disaster of unprecedented proportions. The human exhibit was their most popular attraction. Beings traveled from across the galaxy specifically to observe the infamous chaos species that had recently joined galactic civilization. Humans were legendary for their unpredictability, their tendency to find solutions that defied logic, and their remarkable ability to adapt to any situation. Yet their specimen had become as exciting as watching moss grow. Veltar's assistant, a nervous creature named Quillen, scuttled into the room carrying a data pad. Director, the visitor satisfaction ratings for Sector 7 have dropped by 43%. The gift shop sales of human-themed merchandise are down 60%. The board is asking questions. Veltar's eye stalks twitched, a sign of extreme stress among his kind. The board was comprised of representatives from the 12 founding species of the preserve. They did not tolerate failure, and they certainly did not tolerate declining profits. "What about our request for a replacement specimen?" Veltar asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The Human Diplomatic Corps has refused all requests. They claim the individual we have was acquired through questionable channels. They're demanding his return and threatening to file formal complaints with the Galactic Ethics Committee." This made the situation even worse. The Galactic Ethics Committee had been cracking down on specimen acquisition methods lately. Too many species had complained about relatives disappearing during scientific exchange programs. If they launched an investigation, it could shut down the entire preserve. "What about hiring a consultant?" Quillen suggested hesitantly. "Someone who could help us understand why our specimen has become so inactive?" Veltar considered this. It was unusual, certainly. The preserve had never hired a member of a displayed species as an employee. But desperate times called for creative solutions. Check the Galactic Employment Bureau database. Search for human cultural experts, xenobiologists, anyone with relevant experience. Quillen's multiple limbs flew across his control interface. After several minutes, he looked up with an expression that conveyed bad news. "Director, there's only one candidate in the entire database who meets our criteria and is currently available for employment." The holographic profile that appeared made Veltar's stress levels spike even higher. The human was named Ji-Hoon Park, 34 years old, with dark hair and an expression that suggested he found the universe mildly amusing. His credentials were impressive but concerning. Former xenobiologist with advanced degrees from 3 different human institutions. Extensive field experience studying alien life forms. But his employment history told a different story. Ji-Hoon had been part of humanity's first diplomatic contact mission 5 years ago. Something had gone wrong. During negotiations with the Altarian Commerce Collective, the official reports were classified, but rumors suggested it involved an incident with fermented beverages, a misunderstood gesture of friendship, and a trade agreement that accidentally sold naming rights to Earth's moon for a box of decorative crystals. After that, Ji-Hoon had become what humans called a drifter. He'd worked dozens of jobs across the galaxy, never staying anywhere long. Station mechanic, cargo handler, tour guide, cultural translator. His references described him as competent but unconventional, reliable but unpredictable, helpful but prone to what one employer called initiative beyond the scope of assigned duties. In other words, he was exactly the kind of human that made other species nervous, but he was also the only option available. The interview was scheduled for the next day in Conference Room 7, a sterile white chamber designed to put specimens at ease during initial evaluation procedures. Veltar arrived early, reviewing Ji-hoon's file one final time and preparing his standard questions about experience, qualifications, and ability to follow established protocols. Ji-hoon arrived precisely on time, which was either a good sign or evidence that humans could fake punctuality when necessary. He wore simple gray coveralls and carried a small bag that probably contained everything he owned. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, which immediately put Veltar on edge. Specimens were supposed to show appropriate deference to their superiors. "So," Ji-hoon said, settling into his chair without being invited to sit, "I hear you've got a human problem." Ji-hoon's first morning at the zoo started before dawn. He'd insisted on arriving early, claiming he needed to get a feel for the place before the crowds showed up. Director Veltar had reluctantly agreed, assigning a junior keeper named Binna to escort him. She was young for her species, with bright purple skin and nervous energy that reminded Ji-hoon of an anxious intern. The walk to Sector 7 took them through the zoo's main corridors, past dozens of other exhibits. Ji-hoon stopped frequently, studying each habitat with the trained eye of someone who understood both captivity and the needs of living beings. The Arcturian pack hunters paced endlessly along the same worn path. The vegan tree dwellers sat motionless, on artificial branches that clearly couldn't support their natural behaviors. The massive Neptunians floated listlessly in their tanks, their usual graceful movements reduced to slow circles. "How long have they been like this?" Ji-hoon asked, watching a particularly magnificent Neptunian drift past the viewing window with what could only be described as depression. "Like what?" Binna seemed genuinely confused by the question, bored out of their minds. When they finally reached the human habitat, Ji-hoon understood immediately why visitor numbers had dropped. The space was technically perfect, Earth standard. Gravity, proper atmospheric mix, temperature control that maintained ideal comfort levels throughout the day. It looked exactly like what a committee of aliens might design if they'd studied human physiology, but had never actually met a human being. The previous occupant sat in the far corner, knees drawn up to his chest, staring at the wall. He was thin, pale from lack of sunlight despite the artificial lighting, and his dark hair had grown long and unkempt. When Ji-hoon entered the habitat, the man didn't even look up. "Hey there," Ji-hoon said softly, sitting down a respectful distance away. "I'm Ji-hoon. What's your name?" No response. "Okay, that's fine. You don't have to talk. I'm just going to be here for a while if that's okay." Through the transparent walls, Ji-hoon could see dozens of zoo staff gathering to observe this first interaction between two humans. Their various alien faces pressed against the barrier, recording devices and notepads at the ready. It was like being inside a fishbowl, which he realized grimly was exactly what it was. For the next hour, Ji-hoon simply sat. Occasionally, he'd make quiet observations about the habitat, comment on the weather systems outside, or hum fragments of old Earth songs. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the other man's posture began to relax. "Minho," came a whisper so quiet that Ji-hoon almost missed it. "Nice to meet you, Minho. How long have you been here?" Time doesn't." Minho's voice was hoarse from disuse. "The seasons change outside. I've seen maybe 20 seasons. 5 years. This man had been in captivity for 5 years, and from the look of him, most of that time had been spent in isolation. Ji-hoon felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when he'd seen dolphins in tiny tanks back on Earth. "Well, Minho, I'm here to make some changes. Would that be okay with you?" For the first time, Minho lifted his head and made eye contact. His eyes held a spark of something that might have been hope. The changes started small. Ji-hoon convinced maintenance to bring in furniture that could actually be moved around. Real chairs instead of built-in seating, tables at proper heights, even a bookshelf that he could rearrange. The alien staff protested that movable objects might be used as weapons, but Jihoon pointed out that humans had been living with movable furniture for thousands of years without constant violence. Next came the cooking facilities. The habitat had been equipped with a simple food dispenser that provided nutritionally complete but flavorless meals. Jihoon argued that food preparation was a fundamental human behavior, as important as breathing or sleeping. After 3 days of negotiations that involved health inspectors, safety officials, and what appeared to be a committee dedicated entirely to fire prevention, he was allowed a small cooking unit and access to raw ingredients. The first time Jihoon cooked actual food, just simple rice and vegetables, nothing fancy, the viewing area filled with curious observers. The smell of garlic and onions cooking seemed to fascinate species that had never encountered the concept of flavor enhancement. Several visitors took extensive notes when Jihoon added spices, as if he were performing some kind of arcane ritual. But the real breakthrough came when Minho shuffled over to watch the cooking process. It was the first time he'd moved more than a few steps from his corner in months. "I used to cook," Minho said quietly. Before all this. "Want to help?" Jihoon offered him a wooden spoon. Within days, the human exhibit had transformed, from a static display into something resembling actual human life. Jihoon and Minho took turns cooking, sharing stories, even playing simple games with objects they fashioned from materials in their habitat. They exercised together, stretching and moving in ways that demonstrated human physicality, without the listless repetition of captive animals. But the most dramatic change was in their interaction with observers. Where Minho had ignored visitors completely, Jihoon actively engaged with them. He'd wave at children, demonstrate human facial expressions, and once spent an entire afternoon teaching a group of young crystalline students how humans used hand gestures to communicate. The viewing areas were packed again within a week. However, Jihoon was just getting started. His xenobiology training had taught him to observe behavior patterns, and what he saw in the other exhibits troubled him deeply. These weren't just alien animals on display. They were intelligent beings showing clear signs of psychological distress from prolonged captivity. And if there was one thing humans were known for throughout the galaxy, it was their inability to ignore a problem once they'd noticed it. By the second month, Jihoon had completely abandoned any pretense of being a normal zoo employee. His daily routine had evolved into something that made the administrative staff deeply uncomfortable, but kept visitors glued to the viewing windows for hours at a time. Each morning began with what he called human calisthenics, a series of exercises that demonstrated the full range of human physical capabilities: push-ups, jumping jacks, stretching routines that showed off human flexibility, and occasionally some basic martial arts forms he remembered from his university days. The alien visitors were fascinated by human muscle structure and the way their bodies could adapt to different types of movement. But it was during his third week that Jihoon made a discovery that would change everything. While preparing lunch, he noticed something odd about the viewing windows. They weren't just one-way barriers. They were connected to the zoo's internal communication system. Every habitat had audio pickups and visual monitors, supposedly for safety purposes. But Jihoon realized this meant every exhibit could potentially see and hear what was happening in other areas of the zoo. That afternoon, while Minho napped in the afternoon sun, Jihoon began experimenting. He positioned himself near the main viewing window and started making simple gestures toward the Arcturian habitat across the central courtyard. The pack hunters were magnificent creatures, roughly wolf-like but with 6 legs and intelligence that rivaled most galactic species. They'd been separated from their pack structure and forced into individual enclosures, which was slowly driving them insane. At first, nothing happened. Then one of the Arcturians, a female with distinctive silver markings, approached her viewing window. She tilted her head, studying Jihoon's movements. When he raised his hand in what he hoped was a universal greeting, she lifted one of her front paws in response. Over the following days, Jihoon developed a basic communication system with the Arcturians. Simple gestures that conveyed concepts like friend food, play, and together. The pack hunters were incredibly intelligent, and they quickly began to understand that the strange two-legged creature was trying to help them. The breakthrough came when Ji-hoon convinced maintenance to adjust the habitat barriers for structural testing. He claimed the transparent walls needed stress analysis to ensure visitor safety. In reality, he was creating opportunities for the Arcturians to see each other properly for the first time in years. The moment the barriers shifted, and the packs, hunters could make full visual contact with each other, their behavior transformed completely. They began coordinated movements, complex vocalizations that hadn't been heard in the zoo for decades, and what could only be described as celebrations. Visitors were amazed to witness authentic pack bonding behaviors that had been absent since the creature's initial capture. But Ji-hoon wasn't done. His xenobiology training had taught him that intelligent species shared certain fundamental needs regardless of their physical form. Social connection, mental stimulation, and purpose were as important as food and shelter. The vegan tree dwellers were next. These graceful beings were natural architects, capable of creating living structures from plant matter that grew and adapted over time. In the wild, they built vast communal cities in the forest canopies of their home world. In the zoo, they'd been provided with static artificial trees that couldn't support their construction instincts. Ji-hoon spent days observing their behavior patterns, noting how they repeatedly attempted to weave new structures only to abandon the projects when the artificial materials wouldn't respond properly. During his conversations with maintenance, he learned that the zoo actually had samples of vegan plant matter in storage, living specimens that had been preserved for research but never used. What if we gave them real materials to work with? Ji-hoon suggested to the increasingly nervous keeper staff. Not enough to damage the habitat, just some basic building supplies from their homeworld. The results were spectacular. Within hours of receiving actual vegan plant fibers, the tree dwellers had begun construction of an elaborate nest structure. Their movements became fluid and purposeful for the first time since their capture. The construction process was so beautiful and complex that visitors often spent entire afternoons just watching the architects work. But the most ambitious project involved the Neptunians. These massive aquatic beings were mathematicians and philosophers in their home oceans, capable of three-dimensional thinking that made them invaluable for space navigation calculations. In captivity, they'd been reduced to swimming in circles, their vast intellect slowly deteriorating from lack of stimulation. Ji-hoon couldn't provide them with the deep ocean trenches they were used to, but he could give them problems to solve. Working with Minho, who turned out to have an engineering background, they began creating simple puzzles and mechanical challenges that could be manipulated through the water. The first time a Neptunian successfully solved one of their puzzles, a three-dimensional maze that required spatial reasoning to navigate, the creature's bioluminescent patterns lit up in what was clearly joy. Soon, all three Neptunians were working together on increasingly complex challenges, their movements becoming graceful and purposeful again. By month 3, something extraordinary was happening. The various exhibits weren't just performing their natural behaviors again. They were timing their activities. A tour group would approach the Arcturian habitat just as the pack began their hunting demonstration. The tree dwellers would start their most impressive construction projects precisely when the afternoon visitor rush began. The Neptunians would illuminate their most beautiful bioluminescent displays during evening tours. Director Veltar first suspected coordination when Keeper Soyeon reported seeing Ji-hoon making complex gestures toward multiple habitats from his viewing window. But it wasn't until the security recordings were reviewed that the full scope of the situation became clear. Ji-hoon had established a communication network spanning the entire zoo. Through a combination of visual signals, timing cues, and what appeared to be basic sign language, he was coordinating activities across dozens of exhibits. The spontaneous entertainment events that were drawing record crowds weren't spontaneous at all. They were carefully orchestrated performances, designed to showcase each species at their most magnificent. The zoo had become a stage, and Ji-hoon was the director of the most elaborate interspecies theater production in galactic history. The day of the Galactic Council's annual inspection had arrived with all the pomp and ceremony that such occasions demanded. 500 of the galaxy's most distinguished scientists, government officials, and cultural observers had gathered at the Zephyrian Preserve for what was supposed to be a routine evaluation of research standards and educational value. Director Veltar had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Every exhibit had been cleaned to perfection, all equipment calibrated to precise specifications, and detailed presentations prepared to showcase the zoo's contributions to interspecies understanding. The inspection would follow a carefully planned route, with each stop timed to demonstrate specific aspects of the preserve's scientific mission. What Veltar didn't know was that Jihoon had been preparing too. For the past month, Jihoon had been working on what he privately called Project Unity. Through his network of signals and communications, he'd been teaching the various exhibits not just to coordinate their activities, but to create something entirely new together. It was ambitious, risky, and probably impossible, which made it exactly the kind of challenge that humans couldn't resist. The morning began normally enough. The distinguished visitors gathered in the central observation deck, a massive transparent dome that provided views of 12 major habitats simultaneously. Dr. Cathera, the Council's chief xenobiologist, stood at the podium delivering opening remarks about the importance of controlled observation in advancing galactic knowledge. Today we will witness specimens displaying their natural behaviors in carefully maintained environments, she announced to the assembled crowd. Each exhibit has been designed to eliminate variables that might interfere with pure scientific observation. That was Jihoon's cue. In the human habitat, visible from the central deck, Jihoon began his morning exercise routine. But this wasn't his usual calisthenics. Instead, he started with slow, deliberate movements that looked almost like a dance. His arms swept in wide arcs, his body moved in flowing patterns, and his steps followed a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the observation deck itself. At first, the visitors assumed they were witnessing typical human physical behavior. Several researchers made notes about human motor patterns and flexibility. But then something unexpected happened. In the Arcturian habitat, the pack hunters began to move. Not their usual pacing or random activity, but coordinated movements that mirrored Jihoon's rhythm. Their 6 legs carried them in complex patterns around their enclosure, weaving between each other with precision that took the breath away from observers who understood pack dynamics. Dr. Cathera paused mid-sentence, her multiple eyes focusing on the Arcturian display. "That's unusual pack-bonding behavior," she murmured into her microphone. But the synchronization was just beginning. The Vegan tree-dwellers, working on their latest architectural project, suddenly shifted their construction patterns. Instead of the slow, methodical building they'd been doing for weeks, they began rapid weaving that created spiraling patterns in their living structures. The movements were so fast and precise that the resulting architecture seemed to grow and flow like liquid crystal. In their aquatic habitat, the 3 Neptunians rose from the depths in perfect formation. Their massive forms, each larger than an earth whale, began moving in 3-dimensional patterns that created geometric shapes in the water. Their bioluminescent organs pulsed in waves of color that cascaded through the liquid in perfect mathematical harmony. The Saturnian crystal singers, beings of living mineral who communicated through harmonic vibrations, began producing sounds that resonated through the zoo's structure. The tones were complex, layered, and absolutely beautiful, the first time they'd sung for observers in over 50 years. What made it extraordinary wasn't just that each species was performing behaviors authentic to their nature. It was the timing, the coordination, the way each action built upon the others to create something larger than the sum of its parts. Dr. Cathara's presentation had completely stopped. The assembled dignitaries stood transfixed as the performance unfolded before them. Several junior researchers began openly weeping at the beauty of what they were witnessing. Others frantically took recordings, knowing they were documenting something that had never been seen before in galactic history. The coordination spread throughout the zoo. Exhibits that weren't even visible from the central deck were participating, their activities perfectly timed to contribute to the overall rhythm. Species that had never communicated with each other separated by vast evolutionary differences and incompatible environments, were somehow working together, and at the center of it all was Ji-hoon, moving with the focused intensity of a conductor, directing a cosmic orchestra. The performance reached its crescendo as every exhibit in the zoo began their most spectacular displays simultaneously. The air filled with the songs of crystal beings, the harmonic pulses of aquatic mathematicians, and the triumphant calls of reunited pack hunters. Light danced through water, living architecture grew in impossible spirals, and dozens of species expressed joy in forms their observers had never imagined possible. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence was profound and absolute. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the zoo's environmental systems and the rapid breathing of 500 stunned observers. And then, in perfect unison, every intelligent being in every exhibit turned to look directly at the observation deck. Hundreds of eyes in dozens of configurations. Compound eyes, crystal sensors, bioluminescent organs, electromagnetic detectors, all focused on the assembled officials with unmistakable intention. The message was clear and impossible to ignore. We see you seeing us, and we want you to know that we know. Dr. Kathara's carefully prepared speech lay forgotten on the podium. In the silence that followed, one of the younger researchers whispered what everyone was thinking. They're not specimens, they're people. Director Veltar, watching from the control room as his crystalline structure developed stress fractures from the shock, realized that everything he thought he knew about intelligence, consciousness, and the nature of captivity had just been turned upside down. The zoo would never be the same again. The aftermath of what became known as the Great Synchronization spread through galactic civilization faster than anyone could have imagined. Within hours, recordings of the event were being shared across quantum communication networks. By the end of the week, beings on remote frontier worlds were watching footage of the most extraordinary display of interspecies cooperation ever documented. The immediate response was chaos. Half the Galactic Council demanded an investigation into the zoo's treatment of specimens, while the other half insisted the entire incident had been staged using advanced technology. Religious groups declared it a sign of universal consciousness. Scientists scrambled to rewrite their theories about intelligence and communication. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Ji-hoon found himself at the center of a revolution he'd never intended to start. The zoo's board of directors faced an impossible choice. They could shut down the facility entirely, facing bankruptcy and the wrath of a newly awakened galactic public that was asking uncomfortable questions about the ethics of keeping intelligent beings in captivity, or they could find a way to transform their entire operation before the protests outside their gates turned into something more serious. The solution came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the Great Synchronization, Minho spoke publicly, for the first time in 5 years. Standing in the human habitat with Ji-hoon beside him, facing a room full of reporters and officials, his voice was hoarse, but steady. "You want to know what the difference is between a zoo and a prison?" he asked the assembled crowd. "In a prison, at least they tell you what crime you committed. At least there's supposed to be an end date. We were taken from our lives, our families, our worlds, and put on display for entertainment. We were never animals in cages. We were people in prison, and there's a difference that matters." His words were broadcast across the galaxy, translated into hundreds of languages, and sparked protests on dozens of worlds. Families who had lost members to scientific exchange programs came forward with their stories. Other zoos and research facilities began facing questions about their own specimens. The entire foundation of galactic research ethics was crumbling, but Minho wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "something remarkable happened here. We found a way to communicate, to connect, to create something beautiful together despite our captivity. What if instead of keeping us as prisoners, you worked with us as partners?" That was when the real transformation began. The plan that emerged from weeks of negotiations was revolutionary. Instead of specimens and habitats, the beings in the zoo would become cultural ambassadors. They would share their knowledge, their perspectives, and their unique abilities with visitors while learning about other species in return. The barriers would remain for safety, but they would become meeting spaces rather than prison walls. The first major change was in the Arcturian habitat. The pack hunters, once separated and isolated, were reunited in a space large enough for them to display their natural social behaviors. But more importantly, they became teachers. Their understanding of group dynamics, hunting strategies, and social cooperation made them invaluable instructors for beings trying to understand teamwork and leadership. Captain Jinwoo of the Galactic Security Force was the first official student. He spent 3 months learning Arcturian pack tactics, which revolutionized his approach to commanding mixed species units. They don't just hunt together, he explained to his superiors. They think together. Each individual's strengths compensate for another's weaknesses in ways that create capabilities none of them could achieve alone. The Vegan tree dwellers became the galaxy's most sought-after architectural consultants. Their living buildings, which grew and adapted to their inhabitants' needs, offered solutions to housing crises on overcrowded worlds. The Federation's housing committee hired them to design sustainable cities that could house multiple species while preserving natural ecosystems. The Neptunians, with their three-dimensional mathematical thinking, revolutionized space navigation. Their understanding of complex gravitational interactions helped engineers design more efficient hyperspace routes, cutting travel times between distant worlds by up to 30%. They also became teachers working with young beings who showed aptitude for advanced mathematics and spatial reasoning. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in the Saturnian crystal singers. Their harmonic abilities, once used only for communication within their own species, became the foundation for a new form of universal language. By combining their natural harmonics with translation technology, they created the first truly universal communication system that could convey not just words, but emotions and abstract concepts across species barriers. Ji-hoon found himself with a new job title, Director of Human Cultural Affairs. His main responsibility was preventing humans from accidentally starting interstellar incidents through their enthusiasm for improving alien technologies and social systems. It was, he often joked, exactly the kind of job that only existed because humans were involved. The weekly chaos theory presentations became legendary throughout the galaxy. Ji-hoon and other humans would demonstrate problem-solving techniques to mixed-species audiences, showing how human creativity and adaptability could find solutions that pure logic might miss. The sessions were officially educational forums on human cognitive patterns, but everyone knew they were really opportunities to watch humans break things in creative ways and somehow make them work better. The transformation wasn't easy. There were setbacks, protests from conservative factions, and moments when the whole project seemed ready to collapse. But gradually, other facilities began adopting similar approaches. The Galactic Council established the Ji-hoon Protocol, universal standards for the treatment of intelligent beings, based on the principle that consciousness, regardless of its form, deserved dignity and respect. Director Veltar, after recovering from his stress fractures and undergoing extensive therapy, was promoted to head the new Committee on Sentient Rights. His first official act was to establish rehabilitation programs for beings who had suffered psychological damage from captivity and to create funding for research into ethical methods of interspecies cultural exchange. As for the zoo itself, it became something entirely new, the galaxy's first interspecies university. Students came from across known space to learn from beings who had once been prisoners, to study cooperation and communication across the vast differences that separated the galaxy's many intelligent species. On quiet evenings, when the last visitors had gone home and the exhibits had settled into their nighttime routines, Ji-hoon would often stand where his cage used to be. He kept his original employee badge as a reminder of how everything had started, but now he wore it alongside credentials as a professor of applied human studies and director of the Interspecies Communication Institute. The thing about humans, he would tell new students during orientation, isn't that we're special, it's that we refuse to accept that anyone, human or alien, isn't special. Give any intelligent being enough freedom, respect, and opportunity, and they'll surprise you with what they can accomplish. The former zoo had become proof that the greatest discoveries happened not when you studied life from the outside, but when you joined it and helped it flourish.